Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New Media Show. My name is Todd Cochran, and we're joined today, of course, by my co-host, Mr. Rob Greenlee, and a special guest. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Todd. It's great to be back on the New Media Show, and we've got a terrific guest joining us today, that's for sure. We dive into talking a little about podcasting around the world on this show to some degree, because, well, he's calling in from, it's 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, why don't you...
where he's at.
Why don't you introduce him?
James Cridland joins us. He's the editor of the podnews.net newsletter. It's basically a newsletter that's kind of taken the industry over by storm, I think, and giving us a glimpse into what's happening, really around the world with podcasting, which has really been great. I've been spending a lot of time over in Europe myself, but James, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and greetings and hello from tomorrow, as it currently is. Here.
He's living in the future.
I am indeed. So yes, I'm speaking to you from exciting Brisbane in Queensland in Australia. So even though I have this ridiculous British accent, obviously.
At a ridiculous 2 o'clock in the morning. So I think he's the winner chicken dinner for having joined us at the most obscure time. Of course, James, I'm going to be joining you in tomorrow, later this afternoon. As I fly across the international date line as well. So
yes. I'm just kind of thinking that this is just a little bit of jet lag, basically, and I'm used to that, so that's fine.
Right. Well, we've got a lot going on in the space today, and I just, as always, we don't make any plans when we do this show. We just go live, and we'll talk about the space. And I think what I'll do here is I'll let James give you kind of a moment to give everyone a brief introduction of what you do, your background, so everyone kind of knows where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you. So I run a website called podnews.net, which is a daily newsletter. There's a podcast as well, but it's mostly a daily newsletter around what's happening in terms of podcasting around the world. And I think that's a pretty important thing, because actually when you look at quite a lot of the podcasting news that you see, it's just from North America, and of course there's a lot of news coming out of there, but there's also a lot of news coming out of here in Australia, in Europe, particularly in the UK at the moment. So so I cover all of that. My background, I've worked in radio for the last 28 years or so. So I've been a radio presenter and looking after radio strategy, looking after internet strategy. I ended up launching, I think, the world's first mobile phone app for a radio station back in early 2005. As well as actually launching the UK's first daily podcast from a radio station in the same year, in January of 2005, I think. So I ended up coding the RSS feed for it, and ended up going to the first podcast conference in London in September of 2005. So, and that was interesting. I think that was the first UK conference for podcasting. And myself and another guy called Chris were two people from mainstream media. And I was, I remember being rather roundly shouted at for not understanding what the future was, not understanding anything about podcasting, except there we were already doing, tens of thousands of downloads every single show. So that was an interesting experience. But yeah, so I've been, very much involved in the podcasting and radio space for the last 15 years or so, and really enjoying it. So yeah.
One thing that I think Rob and if you've listened to the show we haven't talked about it in a while, but one of our big frustrations with some of the folks that were covering the space and providing, and I know you don't provide a lot of commentary, although you do write.
I kind of try not to.
Yeah, you do some feature articles once in a while.
Yeah.
But there was a few other, one specifically that just was focused on this East Coast bubble, and I don't, I think that individual is becoming less relevant at this point because he's only focused on that. And so it was nice. I was excited when, you come out with your daily newsletter and we got this whole worldwide scope. I got to see what was going on in Australia, England, everywhere, where you're digging out sources that others had not in the past. And I think, Rob, you would agree with that, but it's hard sometimes. We get in this bubble and we don't know what's going on in the rest of the space.
There's quite a lot of parallels, I think, in between how podcasting has been focusing on what's going on in your own country, and exactly the same has happened in radio. So, typically, if you were to look back about 20 or so years ago, the only radio station that you would care about if you were running one is your competition in the same town. And now, of course, everybody's concerned about everything that's going on. And, podcasting, particularly being really global, yes, there are different business conversations going on in every single country. Yes, every single country is in a slightly different point in the path, but actually, there's still an awful lot of very interesting activity going on. And I think that's been really interesting. And I think particularly being here in Australia, seeing some of the things going on here, and obviously being a Brit and having worked for the BBC, as we all have to at some stage in our life, as well as commercial broadcasters there, I kind of felt that, it was a good opportunity to look at a bit more of a global view of how podcasting is doing, and also keeping it as short as I possibly can. And that's the other thing. I think that there's a lot of very lengthy commentary around podcasting, when actually all you really want is what's happened. Here's a link to find out more, absolutely. But, what's happened yesterday, what are the new deals, what are the new podcasts which are out, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's, hopefully a useful thing.
Yeah, I think it has been. So what I've been doing here is tweaking the colors today. Sorry, as we're talking. So that the screen get a little shadow on James's screen. Rob, I'll let you interject here.
Yeah, well, I was just wanting to talk a little bit about what is happening around the world with podcasting. Like you guys have alluded to, things have been very focused on what's happening in the U.S., but there are a lot of activities happening in other countries around the world, and there really hasn't been kind of a view on that until what you started doing, James, in what's been happening. But kind of take us through this journey over the last couple of years of what you've seen, because I know you've been traveling around the world, speaking at conferences, whether it be radio or podcasting conferences, and coming to the U.S. too. But as you contrast what you're seeing happening in other countries around the world, kind of where is the rest of the world when it comes to podcasting right now, and kind of give us your view on that.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting seeing different parts of the world trying to work out where their future of podcasting is. And what we've certainly seen, certainly over the last couple of months, is we're seeing companies like, WNYC as one example, doing deals with individual companies in Australia or in Canada or in the UK to represent them in terms of advertising, because podcasting has always been global. If you are in an English-speaking country, then there's lots of podcast consumption going on, but quite a lot of that podcast consumption is to North American podcasts. So the most popular podcast, which is subscribed to, at least here in Australia, is This American Life. Now, that's actually broadcast on the radio here as well, but it's actually the most popular podcast in terms of the amount of subscriptions. If you look at, local podcasts, of course, the ABC's stuff does very well here, as does other stuff as well. But there is an awful lot of English-speaking podcasting, which goes everywhere. And I think that's interesting when you start having a look into France, into Germany, into the Netherlands, where the Netherlands, for example, and Scandinavia, lots of people there speak English really, really well. France and Germany, not so much. So actually, it's been very interesting seeing that, Yoruba, the big national radio station there, they've just launched their first, they call it a native podcast, a podcast which they're not just repurposing, broadcast stuff there. And similarly, in Germany, we're seeing lots of stuff from the newspapers, from Audible, which is doing great guns over there, as well as independent podcasters as well. So, I think that when you start looking at those countries where English is definitely a language which not that many people speak, podcasting has been much, much slower. And of course, each individual country has its own weird and wonderful markets. So the BBC, for example, in the UK does, incredibly well in terms of producing talk radio, speech radio, as they call it there. They do that really well. And because they do that really well, they've produced a ton of podcasts. And what they've recently done is they've started producing podcasts which aren't just reformatted versions of their radio shows, but specifically for podcasting. And that's been really interesting because actually that's meant arguably that many people in the UK have found it a little bit more difficult to get in through the door and produce great podcasts because, if you've got a juggernaut like the BBC there with the type of pulling power that they have for a talent, it's quite hard. But there again, really nice to see lots of entries for the British Podcast Awards, which were announced a couple of weeks ago. Lots of great independent podcasts, which have won a ton of awards there as well. So it is really interesting. Every different country is slightly different all the way through.
Sorry.
It certainly seems like there's more and more podcasting conferences and events going on around the world. I got pulled over to one in Portugal. It was actually a journalism conference, the Gen Summit, and did a 2-day workshop in Lisbon. And I know that you just got back from Radio Days, right? So you were at the Radio Days kind of podcasting days event. And so how did that go? I mean, what was the representation? I had heard that there was a lot of U.S. podcasters at that event as well, but I'm sure there's a lot of folks from Europe and around the world at that event too, I would imagine.
So I mean, I've been involved with Radio Days Europe for quite some time now. It's the world's largest radio conference, and what they did last year is they had a spin-off, which was a podcasting day where they were actually focusing on this new area to them, and that's been very interesting. I gather I wasn't actually there, although I covered it, by having a look at what was actually going on. But I did spot, that there were, as you say, a bunch of US people there, but also lots and lots of interesting speakers, particularly around the German market, the Dutch market, where they've got a lot of very interesting things going on. Sweden is fascinating in that all of the individual podcasters in Sweden have all joined together and are doing stats for themselves. So actually, there is a Swedish podcast chart, which is actually a believable podcast chart, which is based not from weird algorithms to do with a subscribe button. So that's a handy thing, So it's really interesting seeing, as I say, some of the differences there, and a ton of really interesting things, that was said at that particular conference. There's also Ozpod here in Australia, which has been run for the last couple of years or so. I think the next one is towards the end of fall, as you would call it, or the beginning of summer, as we would call it, and that's going to be quite nice. And it is interesting actually seeing the amount of radio radio conferences that are now including podcasting in there a lot. So I actually run a radio conference in the UK called Next Radio. Very good website, next.radio. And that this year has a lot more podcasters in there and a lot more interesting stuff for people who are making audio, whether it's on the radio or on podcasting. And I think we're seeing that an awful lot as well.
One thing is kind of interesting is you mentioned that the podcasters had joined up and are, basically pulling their stats together. We've had some calls with them in conjunction with the IAB. I just wish they would adopt the U.S.-based IAB standards. A lot of resistance to that. So that would be my only hope, that they would do that at some point, and basically fall in line with and not say fall in line, but hope they will adopt the standards that have been come up with. It's just by the way.
I think it goes both ways. I mean, I think that NPR, for example, has spent a long time ploughing its own furrow and not talking to international broadcasters as well. So I think wouldn't it be really nice if the entire industry was talking together?
Well,
and not having a US version and a European version, and everything else. But actually, I completely agree. What we need is one standard way of measuring how successful a podcast is. And the difficulty, with a lot of these stats is that quite a lot of the output from them is actually hidden away. So we still don't know what the most popular podcast is in France or in Germany or in the US. We still don't have that visibility because there's no public data which is made available there. And you've got PodTrack that's measuring a small amount of folks who then publish that, and that's all fine. But actually, wouldn't it be great to get much more visibility there, because actually that would benefit all of us, I think.
Well, from a business perspective, most don't want to show their cards. So it's not a matter of, it's totally doable. And I know, Rob, you guys made your stuff public for those that wanted to make it public. But for the most part, most shows, especially those that are in business, don't want to lay their cards out. But it's going back to the standards.
But why is that though, Todd? Because if you run a newspaper, then the readership figures are available for anybody. If you run a TV network, then the TV network figures are available for everyone.
That's not an actual on TV networks. That is a
rating point.
There's no real true number. It's an estimation, because there's no real way to get a real number unless it's a cable. But Rob, what do you think? What do you think the reason is?
Oh, I just think it's something that started out very early, and that visibility wasn't ever really done by podcasters. I mean, I think it's been one of those things too that I think podcasters are proud of their numbers when they're really big, but they're not so proud of it when they're small.
That's true.
Yeah, of course.
There's a little bit of a psychology thing going on here too, but I do think that we're talking about maybe two different things. I mean, if we're talking about trying to find like a ranking chart of the top 25 podcasts in Germany or something like that, it doesn't necessarily have to show the numbers to have a ranking chart. But I guess it just depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about displaying of individual show numbers, or we're talking about displaying of numbers that are kind of rolled up across an entire industry or an entire country. And I agree with the thought that it would be really great to have, a top 200 ranking chart that was actually accurate. I think a lot of people
would be
look
shocked.
at the Apple, of course.
Yes.
The Apple podcast ranking top 200. A lot of people misunderstand what that means and think that it's the top 200 list, and it really is not. And PodTrack is also misunderstood. They think it's a roll up of the industry, and so we're in this kind of this weird zone of people's perception as being wrong, but the industry isn't working together to aggregate numbers because nobody trusts anybody to actually do that properly and be unbiased and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, what's your thought about trying to, like maybe have a, like what's in the music, side, or the movie blockbuster, kind of industry where they roll up numbers and you have a third party, an unbiased third party, kind of manage that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it is, as you say, it's available in every other or many other media, and to a point, the podcasting industry, we've got to a stage now where we've been doing some really interesting things for the last 10, 12 years. But actually, there are bits of the industry, I think, that we actually need to grow up and we actually need to be adults about this. And one of them is analytics. And one of them is also not leaving our entire industry, betting our entire industry on Apple, which is running over 90% of all of the podcast industry.
No, that's not true.
It might be
not even close anymore.
No, downloads through Apple is about 60%. But actually, when you start having a look into where do Pocket Casts get their data for?
That's true, right.
Data from. They get them from the Apple iTunes API, as does almost everybody, with 3 exceptions. That's a real concern because that's over 90% of people. Over 90% of that. And if you have a look at the figures which came out last week, $318 million that the US podcast industry apparently made last year, $318 million. Apple makes that in 6 hours. And Apple makes zero from podcasting. Zero money from podcasting. And why are they going to sit there and bankroll the entire data structure of how podcasting works in the future? And what happens if they just pull the plug? What happens if the iTunes API, they just close that off? What happens there? We're all screwed.
No, my phone explodes. That's what happens.
Poor Todd.
It's a terrifying thing. And so I just wonder whether it's with the analytics or whether it's with the whole system of how the podcast industry works. That's just such an unacceptable business risk. In any other business, it would be an unacceptable business risk to be basically taking all of your data off a different company where you've not even signed a contract, because you don't have to sign a contract to get into the iTunes API. It's a horrifying thing.
You want to come on as a salesman? No, something. And I agree. I wholeheartedly agree with that because, we've talked to app developers and said, where are you pulling your data? Well, pulling it from iTunes, from the API. So what happens if they shut it down? I'll worry about it then. And I'm like, you don't have your own database, number one. You have no infrastructure behind your app besides the API you're pulling from them.
So don't get me wrong. I mean, there are quite a few people who have their own databases and who are running their systems to poll 550,000 RSS feeds, and they're wasting their time doing that when they could be making their apps better. But all of that is going on, and there are people who are pulling in their data. But the only way that they know new podcasts which are appearing is by looking at the by looking at the iTunes charts and working out what's new and what they haven't got in their database already. It's a real worry.
Once again, I'm not. So my new source data comes from multiple sources because the same exact thing. The question came up: what happens if they close the API? How do we update?
Yeah.
How do we, and kind of like, so, we had to come up with our own scraper, and determine ways to find new shows. But it would be ugly. And they have throttled their API before. So, this is something that a lot of podcast apps won't tell you, is that they do throttle from time to time. Too many hits the system, they get throttled, and then the user experience isn't as good for their listeners on their apps.
I mean, Rob, am I going off on one here, or is there a concern on your side as well?
Well, yeah, I think there is, and I think if you back up and you look at the big picture of the whole situation, I think a lot of the apps that are even on Android are using the APIs from Apple. So you kind of look at it from that perspective. But I think over time, and what we're starting to see happen with the potential of Pandora and Spotify, and now Google getting into the mix here. And having something brewing and coming here, that maybe this problem will be fixed. I don't know, but the question gets back to is even Google going to pull on Apple's API to populate their
well, at
catalog?
the moment it is. Yeah,
but probably not. My guess is that they're going to want to build an independent thing and not even get connected up with that at all. But I think that problem is going to be fix. And I think that there's a connection, James, to talk about with you about that, because as you look at, and I saw this at the Gen Summit that I was in Lisbon, where the crowd was asked, how many people in the audience are on iOS versus how many people are on Android? And across the board, and I've heard this at multiple conferences in Europe, but most people in Europe are on Android, right? Is that true from what you're seeing? And if that's the case, then maybe that's one of the reasons that podcasting has been so behind in adoption overseas and around the world. I don't know. What's your thoughts
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, undoubtedly, the fact that podcasting is harder on an Android phone is one issue. I would also say, I mean, I saw somebody in a Facebook group the other day saying, I've got a couple of $100 to spend on some advertising on Facebook. So obviously, I'm going to link people to the iTunes, to my iTunes page. With my money, and you're there going, why would you do that? And they then came back and said, well, most people tune into podcasts on Apple, and you say, well, obviously they will if you're only linking to the iTunes page, So, and my advice to her, which is the same advice that I give to anybody who is launching a podcast, is please do not link just to the Apple site. Link to your own website, and make sure that your own website, I mean, ideally, fix your website so that it shows the right app for your device. That would be the ideal thing. But if you're not doing that, then at least link to more than just, Apple. And some people go, well, what I'll do is I'll link to Apple and then to Google Play. Folks, Google Play only works in the US and Canada. It doesn't work anywhere else. You simply can't get podcasts on it. So why would you do that? And that is just such a frustration. There's this Apple myopia going on. You could probably tell that I don't use Apple devices that much, and I'm on Android. And I'm enjoying Google's new app. By the way, it's it's a bit basic, but it's okay.
I think what it is, Rob, is that maybe James and I are more alike than what we thought we were. Because it's a major frustration for me. Every year when I do the podcast awards, I go through and we have a bot that we built that goes out and basically goes through podcasters' homepages, and it looks for, okay, do they have an RSS feed link? Do they have an Android, some sort of Android link? And basically we're trying to figure out what they're putting on. It's not a perfect science, but it's pretty good. It's about 90% solution as far as being able to pull nuggets off a site, say, what have they linked to? And every year, I continue to be astonished by, number one, only having an iOS link. Not even a whisper of anything linking to Android. It's gotten better, but we started on people are sick of hearing this, but we started on a mission about 3.5 years ago to build Android subscriptions. That's why we launched subscribeonandroid.com. That's why we made one click possible with, I think we're up to 15 apps that support it now. It's the same experience as iOS. You click on the link. If you have the app on your mobile phone, it loads and you can subscribe. Mm-hmm. If you don't have the app on the phone, you're presented with some apps to load. Anyway, long story short, those that have adopted it, and we see on our system, because no one else adopted it except for us, because it was a Blueberry thing, so people said, we're not going to, even though we gave it to the community, no one's going to adopt it. We see huge inroads, huge inroads of new. Well, by this time next year, we will be 50-50 for the majority of our podcasters that are providing an opportunity for an Android link on their website. We see every month, we see the number come down, specifically for that subset of shows. And these are new listeners, not audiences are growing. We see that subset, we see that percentage shrinking. And though we go look at another, because we've got all these stats, I got 50,000 shows we're measuring. I can go and look at a show and look at their website and say, oh, no iTunes link. Yeah, of course. No Android. Of course, no Android.
So I ended up linking, obviously I'm writing about podcasts every single day. One of the problems that I very quickly realized is that I couldn't link to podcasts in a consistent way, because either the podcasts didn't have a website at all, which is crazy from my point of view, or they were only linking to iTunes anyway. Yeah. And so I ended up building, it's just a little script that sits there, and you say, how it comes up with a how to listen, because I refuse to use the S word, so it's how to listen to this podcast. Right. And there's a player, and then underneath there's a whole set of icons that open up the right app on your device. So if you're looking at it on an iPhone, then it'll have Apple Podcasts and Overcast and Radio Public. Mm-hmm. And if you have a look on an Android phone, then it'll have your Subscribe on Android page, but also Pocket Casts and other things in there as well. So it's a really, I'm doing it not because I want the traffic. Genuinely, I don't want the traffic, and I don't really want to pay for all of these additional pages. But I'm doing it because it was the only way to link to a podcast. So my ideal is that I don't have to do that for much longer. But certainly it's been a really interesting experience so far, seeing how people have linked to their podcasts, and actually, we've got to link to Apple. And maybe part of that is we've got to link to Apple, because otherwise we won't get into the Apple charts. Yeah. That might be it.
Well, on that note, too, I just wanted to mention, too, Todd and I, and we've said this before on the show, we definitely appreciate everything that Apple's done to help build this industry. And so, us talking about Android is not necessarily a bash against Apple. Because those guys have been supportive of us from 2005. My bash
is against the podcasters that won't wake up.
Yeah, exactly. So I know that that the opportunity going forward is going to include Apple, and it's going to include at least probably 50-60% of the listener base of the podcasting space will probably remain Apple. But I think that there's this other side of it that we can pick up a lot more growth and build the listener scale. And I know that that's what some of the new entrants into this medium are really focused on, which is the listening side. And I think that's really important.
That's the interesting side about what Google's strategy is of just building podcasts into the search results, and that's the reason why they've done it in this weird and kooky way of building in a podcast app into the Google app, which is installed on every single Android phone out there. It's so that actually, if you do a Google search for something, and it might be for the name of a show, but it might also be just for knitting patterns or something, and it comes back with a podcast, and that happens to be a podcast about knitting with some play buttons in there already. And so all of a sudden, that should, if everything all works out right, switch loads more people on to podcasts. And I think, this is one of the things that I found fascinating. There's some research done in the US and Canada, and it was done with people who use radio station websites. Okay, so radio superfans, if you like. And they were asked, do you listen to podcasts? And some of them did, and some of them didn't. Of the people who didn't listen, they were asked, why don't you listen to podcasts? 21% of people said, we don't understand how they work. 64% of people said, we don't understand why we should. And so really we should be focusing not on the what is it, we should be focusing on the why should I care? We should be focusing on the 64%, not on the 21%. The 21% is fine, we'll go and talk to them about apps and RSS feeds and everything else if we really have to. But actually, let's just focus on the 64% of people that don't know the amazing content which is out there on a podcast, the amazing things that they can actually find. If we focus on that 64%, then we stand to really, really win out of this, I think.
Well, and I think that kind of screams the opportunity of Android here. So,
yeah.
I think we've got to appeal to that side of the potential listener base that is currently relatively untapped, and I think that's the opportunity going forward. And I know I'm extremely supportive of what Google's trying to do, and hoping that Spotify and Pandora and all these folks can really make a dent on that side of the equation, because I agree. I think that there's at least half of the world's population that just doesn't care about podcasting right now because they don't know how to connect to it. But it also begs another question too. Does this industry need to come together a little bit more and work together? And how do you guys think that might be possible? How might we pull together these tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of stray cats that is typically populated the podcasting space?
That's a hard one.
Yeah.
I did want to make one mention to something James said. He said that you like to use the listen word. So I agree. I want people to listen, and I've long said I don't care where they listen, long as they listen. I don't care where they find the show. But ultimately, I want them to subscribe. And I know you don't like using that word, it appears, but when they listen, I give them every opportunity to let them know they can subscribe, because that really is the long-term way to build bigger audiences. But, what Google has done is, I think, a good first step. But until the day that a brand new Android phone is delivered and that there is a dedicated app installed in the Google box in a new Android phone, it's not going to be as effective as anything else. They have to have their own dedicated app. Now,
I think there's two sides to it. There's yes, absolutely, have a dedicated app that sits there. And you can already get that on your Android phone.
But you have to do something to get it there now. It's not.
But you have to do some weird thing. So it's there, hidden away on my phone. But you have to do a weird thing at the moment. So actually adding that icon into the Google Play Store so that it's there makes a bunch of sense. So I would definitely agree with that. But I think again, we're talking there to people. We're talking to the 21% of people that don't know how, rather than the 64% of people who don't know why. And I think we're much better if we focus more on why should you listen to a podcast. That is a much larger market that we can attract. Podcasting is still relatively small in comparison to where it could be, and I think if we focused on the tell me why rather than tell me how, I think that we'll succeed. Which is why podcasting, podcasts appearing in your search results whenever you're using the internet, whenever you're using Google, and you just search for something, and a podcast play button appearing in there, that's a real winner. And I think it's very clever the way that that might change our fortunes a little bit, I think.
If you think about, today when you go to just google.com, and I know most people don't do that because they'll search in the browser, and let's just search for New Media Show. And let me bring this up. I have the right screen. And I'm on a Chrome browser on a desktop, so this is not for a... So if I bring up newmediashow.com, just an example, what we have... Okay, so if you look... I know it's hard to see because I've got the screen really wide. Let me see if I can shrink this here. So you've got all news, video, images, shopping, more. And I really think if Google gives equal play and puts podcasting up here on this top line in these search results, which that would do it. That would explode things in a big way. If they gave equal, because they've got video, where does that obviously go to? That's going to, probably give a lot of YouTube results, which it does. The images brings up normal images. News is news. But if they had a podcast link up here, that's like the golden grail. That's a gift that's going to keep on giving, and that's going to take us to 500 million.
No, I would definitely agree.
Yeah, mean,
if you do the same search
on a mobile phone,
Android phone,
right?
Then that's what you get, and
of course.
Can actually see that. You can actually see, and this was just a. Sorry, here you go. Here's the Google search.
Yep.
So you can see that there's play buttons there already. All I've done is a search for New Media Show. I haven't had to click into podcasts because I don't know what a podcast is.
True.
And I think that's really exciting. But yeah, I agree. I mean, more ways into all of this is really important. And I think it was interesting seeing what Stuart Last of Audio Boom was saying last week in an interview that he gave me, and he was talking about the idea of all podcast companies putting 10% of their marketing budget into marketing podcasts like the Potato Marketing Board. Putting 10% of their marketing budget into marketing podcasts on things that aren't online. So actually getting podcasts into the New York Times, that's a really bad example, but getting podcasts offline, onto the sides of buses, onto billboards, onto all of this kind of stuff, that's really exciting. And if we can get, maybe the Podcast Marketing Board, I mean, will anybody do it? Who knows? But I think that could offer something, quite interesting into where the future is.
But if you, James, I don't know how much exposure you get to American television networks, but there is rarely a day goes by or an hour goes by and listening to almost any mainstream TV here that and I know what you're saying on billboards, on buses and stuff, but I think doesn't an hour go by where you hear someone say, get our podcast. So I think from a television standpoint, at least in the United States, we've gotten huge exposure from television and the likes of, just celebrities and so forth. But that points them towards their shows, but that doesn't bring them back to that, to the 500,000 other shows that are out there. I think you're right. What do you see in Australia? Do you see the Australian broadcasters asking their audience to subscribe to their podcast? Is that a commentary point?
There's some, and I it's one of the things that I get frustrated with is that some of the Australian broadcasters aren't doing a good enough job in terms of that. But, as you say, there is definitely some. The ABC is very good at lots of TV ads for some of the new podcasts that it's been doing. And the same goes for the BBC in the UK in particular, who are doing great guns in terms of that as well. And I think, they are doing a good education process in terms of, explaining the type of content that you can get and how it works. And it helps that they push their own apps as well, because at least that's a way in. But I think there is plenty. There's plenty more that can be done. Actually, only yesterday I picked up a copy of the big quality paper here, the Australian, and that had on the front page a story about a particular true crime investigation that they had been doing. That is their big podcast at the moment, and that is their top story because someone contacted them with some new information into this. So there's definitely some of this stuff going on, but again, it comes down to the 64% of people who don't know why, rather than the 21% of people who don't know how. I think that's a really interesting figure, and just something for us to focus. And the question then comes back, are we better talking about how to listen to a podcast, or are we complicating things if we start talking about, and you can subscribe with this app and you can blah, blah, blah. I remember the video with Mary and Ira Glass promoting Serial, as it was. And Mary, this 80-year-old, was explaining how a podcast worked. And literally it was go to the website and press the play button. And then Ira Glass said, and if you're really into it, then you can find these apps and they'll automatically download it and stuff. But the most important thing is go to the website and press the play button. And I just thought that as a way in, that's a pretty good way in, isn't it?
Most podcasters don't have a website.
Well, yeah, there is always that.
Or they have a website and they have to say, go.
Only there was somebody to help them, Todd. If only there was somebody to help them.
Well, they can help themselves. They don't need me, It's not complicated. They can,
Well, and I think, and I think that the whole topic of subscribe it's not so much the word that's important. It's what the action means. And I think that the action means that listener has made a commitment to listen to that show on a regular basis, and has connected with the show and made a conscious choice to say, I want to listen to this show on a regular basis. And I think that's what we're trying to achieve with it. I think it's great to drive people to just click the play button to what I call is kind of sample the content, to make a choice before you commit to it. And I think that's kind of how I think we have to look at this too. And somehow, I know that on the Spreaker platform, we played around this concept of having your show favorites, right? But it is a little bit of a middle ground between just going to a website and clicking the play button and actually subscribing, because subscribing is, you've made a serious commitment. I think a lot of people perceive the word subscribe as something that you pay for, right? So in some ways, that's a pretty deep engagement layer that a podcast listener goes through to connect with a show. And the whole practice of subscribing and then having the automatic download, as you look to the future, and I'll be real honest, and Todd and I have talked about this whole download model with podcasting and how important it is today. But it does beg the question, how important is subscribing to an auto download in a world that we're all connected to big fat pipes of internet, right? Or maybe what you're favoriting or you're subscribing to is actually just metadata, right? And that metadata comes into your device and it just reminds you that a new episode is available, and that's good enough. But one of the things that will be a limiting factor in the success of your podcast is that subscribe button initiates a play on the platform, whether or not you're listening or not. And I think those are kind of, as you look at where the future of this medium goes, I think that more and more people are going to do the favorite model, because this auto download function it's not necessary anymore. And I think, so what do you guys think about that transition?
Rob, though, you're saying that from a perspective of having lived in the United States and have lots of bandwidth.
No, that's part of my question. There are a lot of places around the world that have ubiquitous big fat pipes going to mobile devices, but you're right. There's other places where we still have this kind of download paradigm that people aren't always connected.
There's places in the U.S. that are still like that too. Go to rural America.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and don't get me started on the internet here in Australia. But I mean, I find it interesting. You look at something like Netflix, and Netflix is streaming first, and then download came along much later. And the same, and the same goes for many other apps like it. And I think it's interesting when you have a look at the Google podcast app. It's very bare bones, but when you subscribe, you are exactly subscribing, as you say, Rob. You're subscribing to a notification that appears on the screen and goes, "There is a new episode of this show." Mm-hmm. But what it's not doing is it's not automatically downloading it. What you can do is you can make it download shows if you want to, but it won't automatically download it. And I think, as you say, I think it is probably just the way that it used to work is, of course, iPods had no cellular connection. iPodder or Juice, way back when, that was a wonderful thing. But again, that was deliberately built that way to suck this programming down so that you didn't have to be connected to your office Wi-Fi when you were having a listen to it. So, so maybe it's a tradition thing that we've felt that downloads are the most important thing, because the other side, of course, is that as soon as you download a file, it gets much harder to do the analytics. And if there's one thing that, and I worked at the BBC on their iPlayer service, and if there's one thing that from streaming, it's exactly when somebody started, exactly when somebody stopped, and getting that information from a download is much harder. You can still do it, but it's much harder, and it depends on every single podcast app manufacturer, app developer, sticking that information in there. And some of them have, Marco from Overcast has point blank said, "I am not giving those naughty podcast makers any data about my users." Well, guess what, Marco? They're kind of our users. They're podcast users as well. Are you really not going to give us any information whatsoever? Is that really the best plan to grow our industry? I don't know. It's a strange conversation to have, I think.
Well, considering
that's rad, right?
That's rad.
That's the NPR rad program.
In the challenge with rad, quite frankly, is that there's huge privacy concerns.
Yeah.
And as a podcaster, I want that data. But as a podcast listener, I'm not so excited about sharing everything that I'm, but as long as it's anonymized, and believe me, everything
and it's going to be now.
Yeah, it has to be because of GDPR. If you look at everything that's happening on online, we're already tracked to the 99th percentile. I mean, they know everything about us. Let's be frank. They know everything. Facebook, they just know. They know us. Most of these sites know us better than our spouses or girlfriends or boyfriends or significant others. Podcasting, we know a little. We're at the 25 percentile knowledge base right now. Really maybe 50. Rad takes us maybe to 60 or 65%, but we're still not implementing stuff that's tracking you, what you're buying and what sites you're on, and we're not doing that in the podcasting space. It brings us back full circle to the stats thing, and for I'm not the only one. Rob from Libsyn, Mark from Podtrack, we've been in this stats game for 14 years, and we understand it very, very well. And the coalescing of the 37 companies that came together to participate in the podcast measurement standards is fantastic. Now, if we'd get all 37 of them to implement the standards they agreed to, that would be a whole nother story. But
and each individual version as well. But yeah, you're right. And I think, just having a look, for example, in the other world of radio and radio measurement, when you're looking at online radio measurement, well, that's theoretically 100% accurate. And I'll tell you now, it's not.
No,
there's absolutely no way. I was reading there's a great blog post from a guy who works for an online radio station in Sydney here in Australia, and he got his stats from his hosting company, and he was there going, well, this is brilliant. We've got, I think the figure was 28,000 listeners every single day. And then he had a look a little bit closer, and he realized that 27,000 of those 28,000 were actually only connected for 4 seconds.
Right.
Yeah. And it turned out that they were stream bots or bots that were just connecting and going, oh dear, this is a stream, I don't want to be having a listen, and so on. And so you ended up with this, headline figure of 28,000, and it turned out to be only 2,000.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not even 2,000 people, that's 2,000 devices, because there is nothing online that measures people. It's all measuring devices. So I can tell you with great certainty, unless I log into everything, but I can tell you with great certainty how many devices access my website. I can't tell you with any degree of certainty how many human beings access that, which is why actually things like newsletters are really interesting from that regard. I have an awful lot more information about how a newsletter subscriber is consuming something and what they like and what they don't like than I do somebody coming and having a look at it on a website. So again, I think you're right that there's lots of issues around privacy. And by the way, I should also say, if you think the US is gone privacy crazy, I ended up speaking a couple of years ago in a conference in Germany, and I was talking about the benefit of personalization, just personalization, nothing more sinister than working out, you're reading all of the sports stories, so maybe we'll give you a few more sports stories, and they said, but that's against the law, we can't do that. And I was saying, why would you want to make it against the law? Why are you so concerned? And then somebody took me aside afterwards and said, James, let me tell you why we're concerned about knowing what other people are doing online. Do you know where you are right now? And I said, well, I'm in Germany. And he said, no, you're in Berlin. You are less than 1 kilometer away from where the head office of the secret police was, and that's where they used to spy on every single German, and you just suddenly realize, oh yeah, there is a big deal here, and it's a deal which is a cultural deal, particularly strong in Germany, particularly strong in some of the Eastern European areas, and that's why the whole privacy thing matters so much to them, because they're there with a lot of very different history than the history that you or I might have had. And you suddenly go, oh yeah, I kind of get that. So it's a really difficult one, but it's really hard on one side to go, we've got no information. How on earth can that possibly work as a media industry as we go forward? But on the other side, wanting as much information as we possibly can do. So there's a real sort of interesting middle ground, and I'm not sure that anybody really knows where we're going there. I
know we've talked a lot about stats here a little bit, kind of around the thing here. Yeah, it's a thing that predominates everything. But looking at the international stuff, I look at Brazil consumption, and there are shows in Brazil that have 1 million million listeners per episode. And we never hear about them being mentioned.
No.
You know, you never hear. There's no U.S. show that has 1 million listeners, but there are shows in Brazil that have 1 million listeners per episode, and long shows, 2-3 hours. You know, so it's a whole different ball game in some of these countries, but their model is different. You know, and how in the culture is different. You got a lot of people working factories, standing for hours on end. They have doing a monotonous job, and they're plugged in. They have to have something to listen to while they're doing that job. So I could foresee in China something like that proceeding, where Chinese shows would have, you know, because it's so much factory work, people sitting in a good set for hours listening to shows. So I think it all depends. Here in the United States, we don't have time 15 minutes to brush our teeth, you know, so it's a whole different, it's a different culture on how people listen is what drives some of these shows in some of these countries.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, India is the fascinating market from my point of view. Lots of difficulties with India. There are 12 different official languages plus in India. So already that makes life a little bit complicated. But certainly the amount of people and their connectivity has changed incredibly over the last 5-6 years. You know, they've moved from everybody having really cheap phones with no data capability whatsoever. I mean, when I was last in India, they didn't even have 3G. Now they've got tremendously fast, very, very cheap data. And already we're seeing lots of folk making great podcasts for Indians that want to keep in touch with everything else. And they're doing things very differently as well. There was a couple of years ago, there was an advertising agency in one part of India that realized that they wanted to get out, the soap powder or whatever it is that they were trying to sell. They wanted to get out ads about that, but there's no real TV in this particular part of India, so TV doesn't really work. Electricity is, sometimes there and sometimes isn't. But they realized that mobile phones were fantastic, and so they ended up building in something which is which was just you ring a telephone number, you let it ring once, you then put the phone down, and the system rings you back and plays you what I guess you could call a podcast, about a 20-minute clip of audio with some music and with some showbiz news and with some ads for the soap powder. And you just think that's really clever. It's a really different way of doing things to essentially give shows free to people with no data costs, with no complicated telephone costs, completely free. And something that, clearly worked for them in terms of advertising as well. So, I think what I find interesting looking in each individual market is just seeing new and interesting ideas of, how to use podcasting and how to use different forms of marketing and different forms of audio as well.
Now that kind of technology, James, was in the U.S. Back in the early days of podcasting. Yeah. One of the companies was called Celicast, where it did that very similar thing. You basically called a unique phone number, and it would play the podcast through the audio calling capability of the phone. This was before smartphones. This was back when phones were kind of stupid and they didn't really have any screens, and so it would actually just play like it was like a phone call, right? So it would play the audio just like it was, somebody calling you on the phone. So that kind of service has kind of disappeared here. But you're right. I mean, a lot of places around the world, I could see that kind of technology coming into like Africa, and I don't know, people don't talk a lot about what's going on in Africa too around podcasting. But I've talked to a few people at conferences around the world that are doing podcasts in Africa too, and there's a lot of activity going on, on that continent as well. So
they're still doing CD sharing in Africa.
Yeah. Well, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult when
wind up radios.
When you talk about Yeah. I mean, when you talk about Africa, it's obviously many different countries, and some of them are very advanced, and some of them aren't. I mean, I covered a podcast network starting up in South Africa a couple of days ago, as one example. And I've linked to podcasts from Kenya and from Nigeria and from many other places as well. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think actually. What we're seeing in some of the and I hate the phrase developing countries, but in some of those places, what we're seeing is they've already got much better mobile connectivity. They've skipped the whole landline stuff and the ADSL stuff. They've got great mobile tech. It's very cheap in comparison. And so actually they've got a great opportunity, both in terms of internet radio and in terms of podcasting as well. And so, again, I think there's going to be a lot of innovation there, but also a lot of opportunity, because they have never been able to have such direct access to European media, to US media in the past. And podcasting, again, by and large, is a very global thing. So, great opportunity, I think, for a bright organization to actually go, well, are there new types of shows that we can be doing? Are there new types of genres that we can be focusing on? I think Steve Pratt from Pacific Content posted last week something about, or maybe it was Dan Meisner, posted something about where is podcasting's Family Feud? Where is the big TV show that podcasting hasn't yet replicated? I was telling this to somebody the other day at a podcast launch here. And he said, "Oh, that's interesting, because I've always thought of podcasting as being the audio equivalent of a bookshop." And I thought that's really interesting, because you walk into a bookshop and what are the books that really sell? True crime, self-improvement, all of the same things that work well on podcasts, with one exception, and that's biography, which doesn't appear to be anywhere in terms of podcasting in comparison. So I thought, well, that's really interesting, and maybe we should be looking at books, the book bestseller lists, to work out what podcasts are going to be really successful in the future, rather than have a look at trying to ape Family Feud or, God help us, American Idol.
I think based on my discussions recently with some very significantly major players, I guess that's the best way I can say that without saying who they are.
Significantly major players.
Yeah. In the, because it's, there's, let's just put a major player in the cable TV space, or in the cable space, is some thoughts on what they're going to be doing with programming that is basically fills in the rest of the pieces to stories that are missing. Like, you take an example, take whatever the run is, 12, 13 weeks. And let's just use Westworld as an example. And it's the company I'm talking to is not HBO. Let's just use Westworld. So if you think about watching Westworld, there's lots of questions that are left unanswered in that program. And maybe sometimes purposely so, because it's going to be answered down the road, but there's all these side stories about people. So think about a podcast that has the actors in character doing some of this backfill in a story form of some of those side stories. To me, that is just one genre that would just explode. It would be, you want to talk about 1 million listeners in an episode, that's going to do it. That's going to be monumentally big compared to the price of that episode for TV was $100,000 or $1 million or whatever it cost them to do that episode, or two. What if they got $10,000 in production cost in a podcast? It's nothing. It's a rounding error as compared to the TV production cost. And this is how you keep the audience engaged between seasons. From a television perspective. So why can't some of that be done, fan fiction be done why couldn't someone come up with their own storyline? You could get very creative with content that's out there, or books, or there's lots of stuff that can be done. And I think those genres really haven't been hit too hard, which really could be, I think, which could really lead some really incredible content that answers your story, James. Why should I listen? Well, there's a reason, this backfills some of the stuff that you haven't heard or want to know.
Well, and actually, most of the content in the podcasting space today is more reality based. I mean, if you look at all the different shows that are out there, whether it be politics to even serial, I mean, those are based on real life reality stories. Mm-hmm. The untapped area of the podcasting space, and Todd, you just were talking about it right there. It's fiction. That is a relatively untapped area of content in the podcasting space today. There just isn't a lot of it out there yet, but I think it's coming. I think that may be the next big wave.
It's just like telling a fish story. The fish was this big, right? And of course, the fish was really that big. So, there's a lot of great people that tell some really whoppers of stories. They need to be podcasters.
But Todd, is that trend line kind of the opposite of what this medium was built on, which is authentic, real life?
I think it's a genre. As long as it's fiction, and you know that you're, it's. I think there's a place for it.
Audio. If we look at our medium as audio, rather than just as an RSS enclosure-based audio file downloaded to a connected or interconnected device. If you look at it just as audio, then of course, radio drama has a long and wonderful history. And I think, absolutely right. I find it weird as a Brit. Watching the Americans rediscover audio drama, and I'm there going,
it went away.
We've got so much of it. Yeah, I know, exactly.
Commercial radio lost its way on that.
It went way of the dinosaurs.
Let's not go there.
About the time, about the time TV came on the market, it went away. So we're talking, a long time ago.
And there's still drama every single day in the UK on the radio. Amazingly.
Wow. That is interesting.
But yeah, I would definitely get that, and I think also, it's interesting. SBS, which is a TV network here, they are running a bunch of podcasts which are specifically TV fan podcasts. Mm-hmm. So there's one around Batman. So they're showing the 1960s Adam West Batman shows. And they've got a Batman fan podcast, which they are, doing, and they are doing specifically about the episodes which are going to be on next.
Right.
And you think that's a really clever plan of, as you say, getting people more attached to the shows that they're watching, and giving them a bit of, the director's cut, the director's commentary, if you like. It's a really nice sort of plan. So it's some interesting things going on there.
The space, I think, is the future is bright. And James, you're right. We got to get more people in. Rob has been concerned about the growth of listeners. He's more concerned about it than I am. So, I think this re-hits home. I don't know, Rob. Has there ever been a survey that's asked that question here that James brought up about why should I listen?
Oh, as far as getting the industry to give feedback on that question?
No. Has that ever been asked of an American audience?
So the data that I was quoting was actually US.
Oh, it was
US and Canadian.
Oh,
but it was US and Canadian. It's a thing by Jacobs Media.
Oh, they did.
It's called the Tech Survey. But it's
Fred,
important.
Fred
it's important
Jacobs
to point out who. Yeah, and Fred does this every single year, and it's a great survey. It's important to point out that it is asking people who are VIP members of their local radio stations.
Well,
so it's asking people who are super fans of radio, or if you like it better that way, super fans of audio.
Right.
And but even with that caveat, it's a very useful piece of data, I think.
But of course, a lot of radio people, though, if they're super fans, I can understand they would respond. Why? Why should I? That's true too. But but at the same,
is it going to be 3 times more than the actual figure?
But it's still a big number.
That's the interesting question. It is still a big number, and I'm sure that we could do a better job at doing that. I mean, heaven knows how many people you probably see every single day who goes, "Oh, so you work in the podcast industry? What exactly is a podcast again?"
Actually, I haven't been asked that question in.
Have you not?
Probably.
Oh, wow. There you go.
Probably 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What's your podcast? And they immediately open up their phone and they know where to go to get it. So,
well, that's good.
Yeah.
Very nice.
So,
and I gave Fred, as part of the tech survey that he did. Yeah, I was down at the Worldwide Radio Summit down in LA where he presented it to the group down there, and I talked to Fred afterwards because I thought that that part of his survey was really kind of undeveloped, right? So, I mean, a lot of the answers that people gave to that question of why they listen to a podcast or why they don't listen to a podcast was kind of, it felt like a little bit of a push off, like I hadn't really thought about it, or it wasn't really important to me, but it really didn't dive into the key question of really why a person isn't listening to it. What is the obstacle? I think the top response was was basically they just didn't care, and I guess that was a little of a problem, right? As you look at the data, because why don't they care? Is it because they didn't identify with a piece of content that was interest to them, or was it that they just didn't know what a podcast was? So there's a lot of questions that we need to dive into.
Absolutely there is. And and this is probably to come back to the podcast marketing board, it's probably one of the things that actually a set of people who are there to further podcasting as a whole might be able to fix maybe. But of course, we'll do the easier things first, like solve world hunger and peace in the Middle East. Once we fix those things, then we'll move on to the harder job of getting podcasters to work together.
Yeah, right.
In the early days of podcasting, there was a sense of true community and working together to solve a lot of problems. Yeah. And that has, of course, we were small. There was, first year, a couple thousand of us. So. Yeah.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Sure.
I think there was a sense of a shared enemy.
Oh yeah.
I think.
Oh yeah.
And I think maybe that is that's the thing which we don't necessarily have as much now.
No,
because that shared enemy is now in our bed as well.
Yes.
In terms of the
who
the
might
community,
that
as it
be,
was.
James? Who might be? Oh yeah, that's right.
People don't realize how much hatred. Who was that group? Who was that group, James?
Well, it was a very entertaining. I went deliberately wearing my Firefox version 1 T-shirt, which I still have. I might dig it out at Podcast Movement. But I went deliberately doing that and deliberately sharing as much information as I possibly could, just in case. But but I think actually a shared enemy is a useful thing because it actually gets us all pointing in the same direction. It's just that our shared enemy might be sort of somebody a little bit different now.
Yeah.
And actually I think obviously we in podcasting can learn a lot from people who've been making audio for the past 100 years. And similarly, people making audio in the same boring way with weird bits of jazz in the middle of a news program, they can probably learn quite a lot from the way that podcasters make audio as well. So I think there's probably a big amount of shared knowledge that might actually benefit all of us,
So,
in the audio space as we go forward.
Talk about beating around the bush.
So James, are you we don't beat around the bush here.
This is why I can't. This is why this is a great release, because I don't do opinion in podnews.net. So this is a great release of me being able to say things that I can't say there.
So I think there was someone had a slogan, "Podcasting to kill the radio star," or maybe that was on a book or something like that.
No, it was not. I think it was on the front page of Wired. Or Wired, or some big tech magazine back in 2005.
But also people need to understand it. Okay,
it's in my presentation.
So there's a reason for those of you that haven't been around long. Really, what it was is there was no way at the time. Let's go back. We're going to go back and just quick history lesson here. There was really the only way to get your voice out there was on a website and have a player. That was really the only way. And people were doing audio online. That was plenty. But that's what
I was doing.
The simple ability to take that media with you and not have to tune into FM 100 in your car, that was a revolution. It was freedom. It was F the man. I am not going to have to listen to your, we say here in Hawaii, kaka. I don't have to listen to your stuff anymore. I listen to what I want to listen to. And people now have lots of choices. It's automatic. I can tune to Pandora. I can go to Spotify. I can listen, watch some YouTube videos. That was not possible.
Yeah.
Well, and Mr. Adam Curry was the kind of ringleader of that.
Yes, he was.
And at the intro of every one of his episodes, he kind of made sure that was clearly the culture at the time.
I can hear it now. Like, what is the? I got to go back in. We got to play that intro.
But you say this, and then the fact is, 93% of Americans listen to the radio every single week. That's more Americans listen to live radio than watch the TV.
Yeah, but my contention on that, James, is are they actually listening?
Well, that's a different conversation. But I mean, at the end of the day, I listen to a fair amount of community radio where anybody can get on. You still have certain rules and regulations, of course. But at the end of the day, great audio is great audio, however it is delivered. And I think one of the difficulties that radio has is that people involved, I'm a radio consultant by day, and that people who are involved in radio think of themselves as being an AM or an FM broadcaster. And at the end of the day, you really aren't. You're making great audio. And the AM FM stick is just one way of getting your great audio out there. And get it out there in as many different possible ways as you can, and tell the stories of the people who live in your community, whether that's your local community or your community of common interest. And that's the thing that I keep on trying to get over to radio broadcasters is stop thinking of your FM or AM mast and think of other things as well. Video killed the radio star is another thing that drives me. There are two things that drive me scatty. Video killed the radio star, which obviously was the first song on MTV, which now no longer plays songs. So that clearly failed. And also the insistence that any website has, whenever they write a story about the radio, they have a picture of an old-fashioned 1960s Bakelite radio, a 1940s Bakelite radio on there to market, this, something that still 93% of Americans listen to every single week. Drives me mad, So, and it's the same with, if you're writing about podcasts, then you have to have a microphone and maybe a pair of iPod, headphones. because that's the way that you talk about podcasting. And, it'd be nice to be able to step forward a little bit from that.
I think, too, is that, we talk about this a lot on the show, is that, radio's got 20 years left. But, it's like the 3 minutes to midnight in the nuclear, Armageddon clock or whatever it is. They have their own clock, and it's 15 minutes or 15 seconds to midnight. They're with
close.
With their digital, with the way digital is, and James, you have kids?
Yes.
Can I ask how old they are?
5.
Okay, so not quite there yet, but you just watch when you give them their first device that they can listen to something with, and they'll never listen to radio.
My daughter is in the room just below us
Mm-hmm.
here, and the reason why I know that she can't hear any of this is because she sleeps with the radio on. But there again, we're not a normal family,
right? So I think we'll see. At least in my household, turn that. If I ever turn the radio on to like get drive, if I usually use Waze or something to figure out what.
Yeah.
My daughter's like, turn that off. Stop. It's they don't want to hear it. So the clock is ticking for radio.
Oh, this is a conversation for another day. I feel sure.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I agree with you.
Well, I think anyone with a teenager kids can see.
We can all live together, man. We can all live together.
Well, if radio is going to have a future, I think they're going to have to change what they do.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And I think, and by the way, you were talking about earlier the differences between podcasting in different countries, and I think radio is almost the reverse of where podcasting is. So podcasting is incredibly advanced in the US, lots of money in it, lots of great talent coming out of that. Radio is incredibly behind in the US, with all of the money squeezed out of it, and with most of the talent squeezed out of it as well, and incredibly inward looking, and doesn't really understand where it's going. And if you look at radio revenue in the UK, in Australia, in Finland, in Sweden, is still going up, and it's going up quite substantially. And there's just this big difference, I think. And I think it's interesting that it's almost the mirror image. And maybe the reason why podcasting is doing so well in the US is because radio is so bad in the US mostly.
That's true.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why. But at the end of the day, we all make great, arresting, exciting audio, and there's lots to share, in between all of us.
Gents, I think we could go 3 more hours. I can't believe it. We're already at 90 minutes, and I've got.
And you have a plane to catch.
I've got to pull the plug on you guys. Yeah, if the show's going to go up, we have to stop now. So. James, thanks for being up at 2:00 in the morning to 3:30. Are you going to go back to bed?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go to bed now.
Okay.
You never went to bed.
I watched a very good play last night and everything else. So it's been a nice but long night.
So if they want to reach you, obviously go to everyone. If you haven't been there yet, if you're not subscribed yet. Let's see if I can go to podnews.net.
Oh, look at that. Very good.
Yeah,
yes.
Go right over there and get subscribed. Best newsletter in the space by far at this point. And James does a lot of good work, so it's important to throw your Patreon support behind him as well, so he can continue to do this.
For your very kind support as well. I really appreciate that. So, thank you.
Well, thank you for what you do. We appreciate it. Because I don't have time to dig through this stuff. I'm glad you are.
Well, I enjoy doing it.
So how can they reach you? What's the best way? What's the email?
Yeah, so podnews.net. You can also drop me an email, james@crid.land. There you go. That's nice and easy. James@crid.land.
Nice.
And I'm also on Twitter as James Cridland or as Podnews.
I bet
either of which will work.
I bet you cheered when the top level domain of .land came out. What winner. Rob,
what a winner for me.
Yeah. Rob, how about you? How can they reach you?
Probably the best place on Twitter, at Rob Greenlee. And you can also send me an email, too, if you have any comments or questions or any suggestions for the new media show. Send it to rob at voxnest.com. That would be great.
And of course, I'm Todd at blueberry.com. We're at Geek News on Twitter. We're off next week because I am in Asia. But after that, I'll be back the following week to give every guys a rundown. But everyone, thanks for being here and thanks for listening to the show. James, we'll have to have you back on. We appreciate you coming on. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time here on the New Media Show. Make sure you stay subscribed at newmediashow.com. We're going to take care. Aloha. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Okay.